everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking today about how top health and wellness brands are boosting their meta ROAS, what they're doing to improve their customer experience, and their first-party data strategy. I'm joined today by Alex, who leads growth at AgelessRx, and Mandar, our CEO and founder here at Blotout. And today we're going to be talking a lot about Meta's 2025 changes, how that has impacted health and wellness brands and what they're doing to drive success on the platform and just improve their signal strength in general and their attribution. So to start, I thought we'd have you introduce Alex and then Mandar and just share a little bit more about Ageless and Blotout before we get into the content today. Alex, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. AgelessRx is a telehealth platform really focused in on driving science-backed solutions, specifically focusing in on longevity and health span. We're on a really interesting point within our company, and we're looking forward to continue to spread the word about Ageless and continue to scale.
Great. And Mandar, do you want
Awesome.
to introduce a little bit about Blotout?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay, and thanks, Alex, for joining. So Blotout is a single-tenant first-party data infra play, and our business originally started coming out of like Brave browser from a privacy perspective, only to realize that like both privacy and performance have a lot more in common than not. And recently we started pivoting into health and wellness, but fundamentally at a very simplistic level, we are a done-for-you marketing stack. What that means is it's a combo of a tag manager and a CDP. But the way we work is we're saying, look, most engineers don't necessarily understand marketing. Most marketers don't want to speak to engineering. Alex can probably attest. And so we sort of stitch that bridge, right? Where we say, look, we come from the ad background. We also come from the privacy background, which allows us to understand both these dimensions really well. And that's really what we do for our customers.
That's great. And I know you say doing the right thing drives better results. And so I know that this year, doing the right thing on Meta changed. They had some new privacy restrictions and changes to their platform. Mandar, can you share just briefly what some of those things looked like for health and wellness brands?
Yeah, I mean, so I believe the date I know when this change happened was actually November 20th of 2024 when I, got the first notice from one of our customers. But in a very simplistic way, let's take some background in terms of general restrictions at the federal level, not even at the state level, where we were never supposed to remarket, like, at the end of the day, um, on topics like health, wellness, and other such. And so when the notices came, all Meta was trying to say was like, hey guys, look, we don't think we want you guys to put a certain set of, data variables in play, or we'll start kind of restricting them. And so when the changes came in, they were unexpected. I would say we saw them pretty quickly, Alex, but they were unexpected because they came sideways and people didn't know how to interpret them. Right. And so one of the things we do at Blotout really well is to kind of say, okay, but what is the interpretation? Like, let's understand what Meta is really trying to say. But when we interpreted them, we were able to solve it very, very quickly. And we were able to explain to, our friends like Alex and others such to say, hey, here's all Meta is actually saying. And they were not as bad as they originally were thought to be, right? They were just adjustments that folks needed to kind of make. But yeah, I mean, when they come in and they start to show up on your diagnostics, it kind of gets scary pretty quickly. And the goal is to just work it out, take a step back, understand what they were trying to say, because this was the first time where legalese sort of kind of came into play. And we were able to kind of, pretty easily kind of work with the legalese and still be able to give performance back into the stack.
That's great. And can you share a little bit more about the role that Meta's conversion API plays in that? And then we'll talk a little bit about the ageless specific situation.
I mean, yeah, look, when cookies went away, and there's a lot, like the amount of folks who don't understand about cookies is pretty large. Like we figured that out in the last 3 years that folks actually don't know how identity on the web really works, and people have very large definitions for them. But at a very fundamental level, think about it like this. If there were no cookies on your browsers, the only way data could be shared between partners was consent and APIs, right? Because at the end of the day, Lindsay's email cannot be stored on the browser because that's a massive security risk. And so that's why the CAPIs exist, and each now growth channel or retention channel has their own APIs. Meta has their own, and it's probably one of the most sophisticated. Our role in the ecosystem is when data is being shared between health and wellness customers or between other categories, like on the financial side or HIPAA side, we need to make sure that we do the right things. However, when I go talk to Alex, Alex's number one goal is growth. And so for us, we have to kind of find a balance between the two and make sure that all of the pieces of the puzzle are working really well. And so that's what Blotout's role is. Being an infra allows us to have Alex's infra look different than, let's say, True Classics infra or somebody else's infra. And so that's how we kind of work with every single partner to make sure their stack is retrofitted so that their infrastructure is kind of synonymous to how their privacy policies work.
That's very helpful. And Alex, let's talk about Ageless for a little bit. Can you share a little bit about your experience joining to lead growth? I know you worked at a couple other really interesting health and wellness companies in the past, and sort of what the situation was when you first started working with Blotout, or even before you found us.
Yeah, absolutely. So AgelessRx has always been pretty well invested within different platforms and different mediums. Specifically, we were really kind of built our original scale pretty much within search. That's pretty much been our core competency. And one of the big tasks that we had ahead of us was really trying to figure out how to best scale Meta. So I think there was a couple of issues on why we were not successful historically. And, one being, I think we didn't have the right creative infrastructure in place to kind of start testing and being able to really test, iterate, and scale. But then the other part of that was our data foundation is not where it needed to be. So this led to, pretty poor signal strength. And I think specifically, I think we hovered around, a 5 EMQ score, which, is not going to get you where you need to be. So we had server side implementation, we had our client side implementation, but ultimately we're not able to really find the strength from a match rate perspective, the deduplication, and our core signal was what really struggled. So I think that's one of the things that really kind of hurt us from being able to get the right look of attribution in place. So if you're playing with different attribution windows, we would have to almost artificially inflate our signal using one-day view, to which ultimately drove the wrong kind of customer. So that's where I think it was a great great opportunity to partner with the Blotout team, because this was even ahead of the announcement of health and wellness kind of upcoming restrictions. So literally we had kind of hitting two birds with one stone. One, we had a goal of we needed to improve our signal strength, and then two, we needed to future-proof ourselves for when the new restrictions were being in place. So that's where I think being able to actually get a sound data foundation in place, pass through the signals that we know we need for success via the Blotout platform. That's ultimately where we started to see strong data signal coming through. We're able to implement the right attribution window that correlated highly to the growth of our new customers. And ultimately what allowed us to really start kind of putting our foot in the gas as it relates to our spend within Meta. And over Q1, we were able to more than double our spend within the first quarter, and that's going through the challenges that the entire health and wellness industry had faced. So I think the big thing that really goes back down to is making sure that we have the right data foundation in place, having a strong signal, because if you have a strong signal, you ultimately know what's working within platform and what's working within the business, and you're able to kind of double down and continue to scale from that aspect.
That's very helpful. And I want to double click on something you said about the EMQ score. So I know some people know what the Meta EMQ score is, and others are new to it. Can you explain a little bit about what it is from your perspective, why it's important, and sort of where you are with that now that you're using Blotout?
Yeah, so effectively EMQ, event match quality score. So we're passing through a number of events, and previously it was the standard Meta events, and they're scored based on what you're able to pass back from the user and how they're able to match within the platform. So that's where I was mentioning previously, where we had our client side set up, we had our server side set up, but ultimately we're not really talking to each other, so we're not able to deduplicate as best as we could. So, then partnering with the Blotout team, being able to get that all under one roof under the conversions API, we're able to better match against our core outcomes, our core conversion events, become a lot more privacy and compliant friendly, and still receive a better score. So, we're averaging, like I said, between the different events, probably around 5. Now we're hovering somewhere, between 8 or somewhere between 7 and 8, mostly on 8 on our core events, which is ultimately what we want to see. And then when we are able to do that, I think we're actually seeing about 10 to 20% improvements within our customer acquisition cost efficiency. So that number really does matter, because if you're below, I'd probably say 7, you're going to be struggling within the algorithm, because if you can't match within Meta, you're going to be, somewhat potentially penalized based on paying a premium for CPMs. You're going to see a downward trend from an engagement perspective. So you want to make sure that you can match your signals within the Meta ecosystem.
Very helpful. Mandar, would you add anything to that about improving signal strength, or just pro tips around improving your infrastructure for Meta?
Yeah, I mean, this is me reiterating and preaching to my own choir. So for what it's worth, take it with a grain of salt. But the knowledge required to understand how signals are rebuilt between client side, server side, how they get deduplicated, what needs to be the variable that kind of stays longer, what will meta take, what will not meta take. There's a lot of engineering, we call it reinforcements, that kind of go into it. And like, Alex has kind of gone through where he's seen a server side stack fail. Most customers don't understand that engineers are not well versed to understand these variables, because these variables didn't exist even 5 years back. These are very, very new variables in the industry. And so being able to kind of reinforce yourself to say, I actually know how long this variable can go, and kind of tune it for an infrastructure, plays a very large part in thinking. Because to some extent, you can, like Alex, and I'm saying this in Canada, you can manipulate the scores. It doesn't mean it's going to come back at the backend outcome and say, look, this worked. But when you're able to hyper tune those variables for a particular infrastructure and say, hey, look, we are good here. Things look like we've gone through the 8-10 cycle, things are trained. You can do that much more, because Alex said something very important, and it's very critical to understand that. The goal is never to think about audience matching or EMQ. The goal is, can I scale my spend? Because the business only moves forward when you can scale your spend. And that's really what we focus on in our stack, right? Because score manipulation is very rampant in our industry. That's not the goal. The goal is to say, was I able to create a meaningful outcome from AgelessRx perspective? And that remains the critical part of how we kind of build the foundation of the platform.
Yes. Yeah, and so Alex, you did say you were able to scale your spend, and before we move forward here, I'm curious, what are some of the growth KPIs that matter most to you right now that you're interested in tracking, or that you're newly able to track more accurately and trust?
Yeah, so our core metric that we focus in within platform is kind of twofold. It's customer acquisition cost and in return on ad spend. So, those are the two core variables that we're really looking for to be able to provide to Meta, to make sure that we're feeding back the right data, and that we're able to target new customers and target prospective customers in a much more efficient manner that ultimately correlates to what we're trying to see within the back end, so that we can continue to increase our rate of spend, and still maintain our levels of efficiency. So it's one of those things where our business is pretty unique. Ageless as a business, we tackle multiple categories. Whether it be, weight loss, energy, cognitive function, general longevity. Each different category has multiple products, multiple SKUs associated with, and multiple AOVs. So making sure that we're, again, passing back the right signals back into our platform, ultimately back into our campaigns and ad sets. It's pretty critical to understand how exactly each piece is performing, so that we know what's working and what's not.
Very helpful. And I think that actually brings me to my next question around top tips for health and wellness brands. And Mandar, maybe you can speak to this, because I think one thing we frequently hear from customers is that they face this same challenge of having many SKUs and segmentations and such nowadays. Do you have some tips to offer health and wellness brands who are listening? And any related to this topic?
I mean, look, I think there is a lot of misconception in the industry, and this is fully ranged, right, from challenges that kind of come from within the platform or challenges that come from regulatory or like the goal is look, advertising is here to stay, right? Like there's this misconception that it's going away. However, human privacy, our own dignity, like is at play. So there's a lot of ways by which platforms are adapting for you to be able to say, look, I can actually work with the platform, say Meta as an example, to be able to kind of continue to grow your business without having to compromise any of the privacy pieces that we've been talking about, right? We do that for AgelessRx today. And so at a very fundamental end, the goal is not to kind of breach those lines. The goal is to say, how do you work within the lines and still have a decent amount of, like we call it ceilings, right? To kind of reach out to saying, how far can I grow before I can hit my next level of optimization? And then there's also the next level of optimization. We just worked with Alex's team last week to kind of create the next level, which is, what we call as prospecting acquisition kind of strategies, right? And so there are these layers where without having the fundamental, breach of privacy that is essentially what Meta is trying to kind of, push back on, you can still achieve your goals. But if your platform is not able to explain why they're applying a solution, the next one's going to cost you. And so from a health and wellness perspective, the goal is to be able to explain to your customer why you're making a certain change or why you're providing a certain solution. And if it's not logical or you're not able to explain how it kind of manifests into growth, you're going to be fundamentally challenged somewhere along the way. Because we call it the day 4 in the 10-day journey. And by the way, last year was kind of day 3, because these changes are coming. Every year we've seen changes at Apple or changes at Google or changes from Meta or changes at FTC levels. We can continue to see that the world is getting to be a better place where data is not just shared without consent or without, kind of any checks and balances. It does not mean that advertising is going away. There are solutions in place. If you understand the legalese, the compliance nature of things, that you can always work with your brands to keep moving the ball forward, right? Because there is market for them and there is definitely demand for it. And so how do you connect that market to the demand is really the larger question.
Great point. And Alex, what would you add on just tips for health and wellness brands looking to advertise on Meta and improve on channels like Meta this year?
Yeah, so just building on the conversation here, it really all starts with your data signals. So I would highly recommend making sure that you are providing the right signals back for that can correlate to actually optimizing for your business growth. So there are different ways to kind of manipulate the funnel, but there at the end of the day, there's one core KPI that really should be the core focus. And how do you have the infrastructure in place to drive that KPI? So once you have the data foundation in place, then it becomes just about significant volumes of testing, and that's one of the things that we love doing here is just testing anything. So from the very beginning, it's starting with the basics and fundamentals of what is the right attribution window for you. You're running tests and ultimately seeing, is it 7-day view or 7-day click plus 1-day view? Is it 7-day click? Is it 1-day click? Like that's where there's going to be nuances across multiple businesses, but that's why it's so important and critical to test to make sure you understand what is your true path to conversion. What does your customer journey look like? At the end of the day, for us, we're a pretty highly considered purchase cycle. So there's going to be things that ultimately fall outside of a 7-day click window. How do we adjust for that? So those are things that we're all trying to take into consideration. And then from there, is it great? Are we driving new customers versus returning customers? What is that prospecting versus retargeting mix? So that's where, especially as it relates to campaign types within the Meta platform, whether it's ASC versus BAU prospecting, it's going to perform differently, and depending on we run both and we test both. Sometimes we see a little bit heavier levels of retargeting in our ASC accounts, and that impacts how we're able to deliver and how we're able to scale. Whereas a lot of the time, sometimes we still see better overall performance from just BAU prospecting. So it really is I'd say dependent on each brand, but that's why it's so critical really understand testing. And I think some of the newer features that are coming out within Meta specifically, like being able to optimize for incremental customers, like that's something that's super important to test because that's one of the things that we care about, and we ultimately work with third-party measurement companies to make sure that our spend that we're putting into the marketplace is incremental and that we're continuing to focus in on growth. So, like I said, kind of going back is it's really about once you have your foundation in place and you can trust your numbers, it's being able to test everything, and then that's when you get into the fun part about what creative works. And being able to slice and dice that. That's the one thing I think is also critical for just health and wellness is especially as it relates to getting more into like telehealth, telemedicine, is there's so much education that needs to happen, especially in kind of a vertical like ours when we're talking about health span and longevity. We're still relatively new type of content or topic content. That hasn't reached kind of, I'd call the average population. There's just a lot of education that needs to be done. So I think it's also important from, talking about creative testing is what are you doing to help your customer? Why do you exist as a brand? So, that ultimately comes down to, the fun part and building out a really strong foundational creative engine to make sure that you're putting the right message out in the right value proposition out that your customer will ultimately care about.
That's a great point, and I can tell that testing and attribution are topics that you're really passionate about. And Mandar, I wanted to ask you as well. So I know we sort of have the same belief that if you get your data strategy right, there are sort of endless opportunities to continue to improve the customer experience or the patient experience or what have you. What are some of the biggest opportunities you see for health and wellness brands this year, whether it relates to data or just improving their customer experience in general?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it's more of the philosophical view. I think Alex might be better attuned to kind of answer this because he lives this life every day. But like, to the points he made, I'm going to reiterate them, right? One, just because you have server-side signal doesn't mean you've solved it, right? Like take a look, see what the scores are, see what's matching, see if you are actually up. Because at times, like an hour, 2 hours spent to fix those things can generate benefits in millions, right? And there is a little bit of ignorance of that in the industry because focusing they've solved it, and so they kind of move away from it. The rest of them to me are like more on the philosophical zone where people think, oh, they're restricted or they kind of got caught up in a particular compliance net that they're done, and the answer is no. Like the goals between platform sharing is to make sure that a consumer's privacy is not breached, right? Consumers, rigidness around data sharing is not sort of, exposed or enabled. And so for us, it's more about saying, hey, look, as somebody who kind of lives these lives, and we now have we have everything from churches all the way down to like very, very core HIPAA platforms as infrastructure. We are able to work through these challenges with a lot of our customers to say, okay, how do I kind of make sure that we stay within the legal spectrum and the compliance spectrum and still be able to work? And remember, Meta-specific health and wellness restrictions are not legalities, right? These are changes Meta is just expecting from the advertisers so that they can continue to scale. And being able to kind of have these handshakes with the legal teams and with the growth marketing teams in the same room just enables those conversations to move faster. And that's really all I can tell is don't think any of these things are like blockades, right? Think about these as enablers for the future growth of your business.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know that that is true that working with folks and meeting with them regularly helps us keep on top of what's coming next. Alex, do you have anything else to add before we wrap up here?
No, I think reiterating a couple of things, especially someone a platform like us, especially in health, telehealth and health and wellness in general. I think it's critical to make sure that you're ultimately taking care of your customers, and that's one of the things that we want to make sure from our perspective is we are taking as much privacy or taking privacy into consideration as much as humanly possible while still maintaining our ability to scale. So I think that's something that's critical because ultimately you don't exist as a brand if you're not doing everything you can to help support your customers. And then I think as it relates to as it going for whether it be first party data strategy or cu customer experience. I think going back to the original foundation and kind of thesis of making sure your data is in order. I think what you have, like, your baseline, that's where you start to have a lot more fun with some things as it relates to testing. So there are things that you can really try to understand from your customer journey, that won't show up within Meta. So that's where things get really curious, where you really try to understand the incrementality of things, and that's where you're trying to match your data cross-platform, whether it be with your own business metrics through your email systems, your measurement systems, where you might have campaigns that look a little soft on the front end, but when you start looking at things on the back end, whether it be your business or just kind of how you're measuring incrementality, it actually looks really, really good. So that's where I think there's ultimately, and this is where you can start slicing and dicing of, like, what do some of your mid or top funnel events look like, and how does some of your performance correlate when you're driving some of those top mid funnel events that translate ultimately at a later date to kind of some of those more purchase or conversion events that are the day zero revenue driving events. So those are some fun things I think that ultimately we also have to look forward to from a scale perspective, is really trying to get a little creative and understand from a creative messaging standpoint, what's resonating with someone, but ultimately just gets them in market. Whereas we know that they're ultimately going to take their time to research and look on or look at multiple different opportunities, but ultimately come back some days that are outside of that kind of natural in-platform conversion window. So there's so many different ways to slice and dice data to make sure that to understand what's driving your business forward. But I think ultimately, making sure you have that big foundation in place is a kind of core first step.
That's great. And one other question for you, selfishly, where do you go to keep learning about all the new experiments you're going to run around, the latest trends in data and attribution and such? Where do you go to just kind of keep learning about all of this stuff?
Oh, I mean, really, it's all over. I mean, I think anybody that spends time in your ad accounts, whether it be in Google, Meta, TikTok, and then matching up with your kind of what your business metrics are, there's always going to be questions to ask. So you can point to any one number and try to cut it 1,000 different ways to really understand what's driving that number. So I think, that's first and foremost what we do constantly. And then, we have really great partners that we're always trying to understand, what are some of the best practices, what are things that we haven't tried. So, working with Mandar and team in terms of what are some other brands, what are other brands testing that may be outside of our vertical, or some of our agency partners that operate, within, D2C retail. So there's just a lot of, like, working with a lot of our strong partners, and that's where I feel like we've aligned ourselves with really, really good partners that can provide a lot of best practices, different ways of thinking about things, and then ultimately just making sure that all ties back to what are some of the core hypotheses that we have within the business, and how do we put them to the test and see what ends up working out for us.
Great. Anything you want to add, Mandar, before we wrap up here?
No, this is awesome. Thank you, Alex. Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah, well, I'll just
Both,
say
yeah.
that increasingly we are trying to document some of the best practices that we're seeing across 1,500 different brands. You can scan the QR code here and get a playbook we just put out for wellness brands specifically as it relates to reclaiming meta performance. But expect more content like this coming soon. And Alex, thank you so much for your time today. Mandar as well. If folks have questions, please feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn, or, just email us directly. Mandar at blotout.io is a good place to start. And thank you so much.